Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. I'm going back to my academic index. On the module DD211, I want to influence you today. Young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. You need something of compassion. You need something to wake up in the morning. You need to change diets in your job role, perhaps. Or get yourself educated. Adult learning. College, university. When you read your academics, you should record your reading. On the module DD211, understand politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. On page 142, make sure you let the person know where you get the information from. Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, the book's published. First published 2015, second edition 2022. On chapter 17, globalisation of world politics. Expand the globe from McDonald's to Adidas to see how companies now have a global reach. Proponents of the global market economy point to the economic growth that this form of globalisation has stimulated. However, such developments can also lead to inequality. Interdependence does not necessarily mean an equal relationship. And in the global capitalist system, there will always be winners and losers. During the 1970s, the perceived imbalance in favour of developed nations fueled discontent among developing countries, which wanted greater representation in world economic institutions and a fairer trading system. This was followed by the rise of the neoliberal agenda in the 1980s, which prescribed further free trade, liberalisation, deregulation of markets, and regulation of national industries. As this agenda gained currency among developed nations, the international financial institutions followed suit. Attaining stringent conditions to membership and for access to their loans, which further increased inequality in developed nations that were reliant on Western-backed financial institutions. The perception of growing inequality has been one of the key platforms for the anti-globalisation movement. While hard to define as it combines a wide range of different activist groups holding various positions and political alliances. The anti-globalisation movement's overall aims are to redress the perceived imbalances of global capitalism. The global financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank are seen as tools that are powerful promoting corporate interest and increasing equality in their defence. These institutions claim that they are aiding development through their commitment to free markets, pointing to the increases in income, decline in poverty, and increase in access to basic necessities. The global economic crisis of 2007-2008 and the subsequent extended period of austerity further brought into focus the power of global financial elite that had long been the target of the anti-globalisation movement. The role of banks and perceived complicity of governments that had allowed unsustainable levels of debt to build up and become the focus of the globally networked Occupy movement. This group chose the slogan, "We are the 99%," in response to the consolidation of wealth by the global financial elite. While the primary force behind globalisation has been an economic one, there have also been other currents of globalisation, namely political and cultural, which we will now briefly look at in turn. You too, you take care, Una. Lovely to see you. We'll have a break in about 20 minutes, 15 minutes. Page 143, political globalisation. Politics has traditionally been associated with nation states and their respective political systems, with responsibility for security and welfare failing to national governments. However, states no longer have a monopoly on the way the world and its economy is governed. As its economic, environmental and other issues become global in scope, so too do attempts to manage them, which has meant that the states have increasingly acted in cooperation with one another through intergovernmental organisations such as the United Nations, UN, and the IMF and World Bank, as mentioned previously. And regional groupings such as the European Union, EU, The proliferation of INGOs can also be seen as forming part of a process of political globalisations. Groups such as Greenpeace and Amnesty International are political actors on the world stage in their own right, lobbying governments on causes and seeking to change or enact certain policies, something that once was the sole preserve of national governments. We can identify 3 areas of political globalisation, which will crop up again as you work through this block. Intergovernmental institutions such as the EU, UN, and the WTO, which involve states pooling their sovereignty and cooperating with each other. Cooperation over human rights and humanitarian interventions such as the UN Declaration of Human Rights, affiliated UN bodies, and peacekeeping missions and adherence to international law agreements, non-state actors such as INGOs, including local and transnational networks campaigning on a range of issues from the environment to human rights, and terrorist networks. Political aspects of globalisation can be seen as an extension of political power and political activity beyond the boundaries of the modern nation state. Hence, we can see the movement for a system of a territorialised nation states to one of global governance. To speak of global governance does not mean a world government in terms of a single political authority for the world. Rather, it points to the importance of transnational institutions and the relationships between them. Therefore, global governance can be thought of more as a cooperative endeavour that involves a multiplicity of actors of the world stage and their responses to global issues. An example might be an issue such as the environment, where states may cooperate with intergovernmental institutions such as the UN and with non-governmental organisations to tackle a shared global problem. Cultural globalisation, advances in information technology and international travel have provided the means for people and cultures to interact in ways that were not possible just 50 years ago. This has enabled a diffusion of cultures across the globe, seen through symbols and global media operations, to name but 2. Symbols of globalisation are often equated with Western, primarily US-led companies and cultural products. Such predominance could lead us to question whether this is globalisation or, in fact, Americanization. This is tied in with the continuing dominance of liberal economic order and associated practices of a consumer lifestyle. But is cultural globalisation a purely one-way street? Critics might not point to the increasing homogenisation or coming together of popular culture in which Western remains dominant. However, there is a paradox at the heart of cultural globalisation in the sense that the tools that have enabled this homogenisation to occur, communication technology and global media, also help us understand the heterogeneous or divergent strands of different global cultures. One only has to look at the different international news channels that broadcast in the UK, such as the 𝕬𝖆 and Russia Today, to see how different perspectives and developments in the world are now accessible. Also, one can point to an associated process of globalisation, that of glocalisation. This is where particular local characteristics are simultaneously incorporated into universal or globalising tendencies. An example might be seen in the way that the global fast food chain adapts its menu to serve local tastes in different parts of the world. Or a business may tailor its advertising to appeal to local cultural norms. Migration has also played a major role in cultural globalisation. International migrants can be seen as important agents enabling globalisation owing to the networks they create between their places of origin and subsequent settlement. Migration has been further embedded by the proliferation of cheaper air travel between countries. A typical UK city might now offer a whole range of foods from around the globe, have shops selling Chinese medicine, and host concerts with international performers. Therefore, we are exposed to a range of global cultures that can help us challenge the assumption that the world is moving towards a consumer-led Western-inspired norm. Indeed, there is a long tradition of resistance to perceived Western cultural imperialism. This can be seen as countries such as Iran, where Western satellite broadcasts have been officially banned by the state for fear of promoting un-Islamic cultural norms. However, the ban is widely ignored, and broadcasts such as the BBC Persian from Iranian diaspora communities in the West, many of whom are living in exile, have a wider audience with Iran. Social media has also played a significant role in bringing global events to wider attention, such as advances in communications technology allow ever greater exposure to do things that may once have seemed far off or distant, but now are brought to us in real time. This has allowed once disparate groups to find common cause and share ideas and techniques for political action. The Occupy movement, for example, was influenced by the actions of protesters taking part in the Arab Spring and found common cause with them despite their having different agendas. Hello, Jess, how are you? The globalisation debate, myth or reality. So far, this chapter has presented a picture of changing world heading towards ever-increasing interconnectedness, economic independence and cultural interaction. I'll be with everyone in about 10 minutes. However, big ideas or phenomena such as globalisation are rarely left alone without challenge and critique. As such, it is important to note that the notion of globalisation, or at least certain explanations of it, is not universally accepted despite the proliferation of the term globalisation, as mentioned above. Some people have opposed aspects of globalisation via the anti-globalisation movement. But what if we look at the concept itself? Is this a process that can be just accepted as part of the world we live in, or is it something that can be exaggerated, or perhaps serves the interest of global economic market that drives it? Historically, two main schools of thought can be discerned in the study of globalisation: the so-called hyper-globalists and the skeptics. Naturally, there are divergent strands within two camps. A synchronized overview of the key arguments is set out below. Adopting the hyper-globalist perspective, scholars such as 𝖀𝖓𝖊𝖆𝖊𝖆𝖏, and others have tended to focus on the perceived victory of neoliberalism, celebrating the emergence of a single global economy. This has subsequently led to a borderless world where economies are denationalised through the established or transnational networks. The result is that national states becomes less meaningful, as they are merely cogs in the machinery of the global economy, with TNCs becoming increasingly important and in many cases more powerful than states. This is accompanied by the spread of institutional global governance such as WTO and IMF, which further erode the importance of ultimately the sovereignty of the state. Liberal democracy also forms of this part emerging global civilization, with market principles as at its core. As such, 𝖀𝖓𝖊𝖆𝖊𝖆 famously referred to the end of history in proclaiming the universal triumph of the Western liberal democracy following the world of the Cold War, and saw this as a resolution of ideological struggles that have characterized human history, making international relations primarily just as a matter of economic questions. One of the most prominent skeptic critics of the hyper-globalist perspective, which has sometimes been termed the globalization hypothesis, comes from the work of Hirst and Thompson, who argues that the idea of globalization as a major transformational process requiring national economics to obey the market is something of a myth. They argue that rather than being more interconnected, the world is actually less interconnected than it was during the high point of European colonial empires in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which we discussed previously. Like the hyper-globalists, Hirst and Thompson also focus on economic processes, but in doing so, highlight what they perceive as an exaggeration of globalization trend, despite the supposed transformational power of capitalism. The argument is that the developed world is still commanded in financial investment and trade concentrated in the states of three blocks, in particular, North America, Japan, and Europe. They also note that the much Trump TNCs are not always global in their reach and many still operate from national bases. Instead, they argue that the current trends can be seen more increasingly internationalisation rather than globalisation. How then is internationalisation different from globalisation? Both ideas point to the increase of interconnectedness. However, as we have seen, globalisation is viewed by hyper-globalists at least as leading towards one global economy where borders become meaningless and nation-states are subservient to global market forces. On the other hand, internationalisation can be seen as a growing independence between nation-states, hence international, who remain as primary actors in world affairs. Thus, the sceptical standpoint takes a view of the governments that are actually the key drivers of the process of internationalisation, and that they are still the actors are most capable of setting the agenda through instituting varying policies. For others, such as Rosenberg, globalisation is seen as no longer a relevant term, and will in time just become another word for independence, Rosenberg 2005. This view continues the sceptical tradition of questioning the transformationalist aspects of globalisation, seeing the term as a conceptual folly, owing to the fact that attempts were made to cast theory out of a concept that was fundamentally descriptive and empirical, rather than explanatory. This means that the concept purely described what had been occurring, rather than explain how it came about and why it is important. You might like to consider whether the earlier description of economic, political, and cultural globalisation were descriptive or explanatory. Up to this point, we've been discussing the idea of globalisation and highlighted how it does not necessarily need to be taken as a given when we look at global politics. It is possible to see how there are many different interpretations of the process and events that constitute its analysis. The preceding sections have demonstrated that studying world politics is about more than just relations between states. However, nations remain some of, if not most important actors in global politics. The discipline of IR provides us the same useful analytical tools to help us understand how states interact and why they may act in certain ways. And we will now explore these further. How do we understand world politics? Approaches from international relations theory. Political concepts and ideologies are born of a need to make sense of and explain the world around us. The same can be said for theoretical approaches that stem from the academic discipline of IR, insofar as they serve as a tool to help us understand and explain real-world events and issues. This is an area of study whose subject matter can be changed rapidly by events. Therefore, it is important to be able to analyse a contemporary world rather than just describe what is going on. But this is not just a case of offering abstract models or theories either. Using theoretical frameworks allows us to analyse or interpret events. The real world of global politics, incorporating as it does state institutions and multiplicity of non-state actors, is a messy and contested affair. As a result, IR theorists have sought to provide theoretical frameworks as a means of making sense of it all. While the focus has traditionally been on the interactions and behaviour of states at the international level, the discipline has evolved to incorporate a global perspective, comprising a range of actors while maintaining the centrality of states. Historically, two main schools of thought, realism and liberalism, have been the source of key arguments with the discipline of IR. These have been joined by a third, more recent school, constructivism. While some abstraction is necessary here, each theory has been illustrated with the real-world example of the China-US relations to help you see how the ideas can be interpreted into practice. Realism. Realism draws on the works leading to the 20th century IR scholars such as 𝖀𝖓𝖊𝖆𝖊𝖆, 1939, and 𝕻𝖆𝖊𝖆𝖊𝖆, 1949. It holds essentially of the state international affairs. Realists argue that the condition of anarchy exists beyond the boundaries of the state. So the international systems is described as anarchic. Anarchy, the international relations, does not refer to disorder as chaos, but rather to the absence of a legitimate central authority. The second key feature of the international system for realists is the idea of balance of power. Last page. This is a principle by which states, fearing the potential threat of either other states' military capabilities, balances with and against one another to ensure their security. Birchall notes that the search for power and security is a dominant logic in global politics, and that states, as the primary actors in the international arena, have no choice but to accumulate the means of violence in pursuit of self-preservation. From this statement, we can discern three core elements of realism: statism, survival, and self-help. So let's try to pull these out when unpacking the statement. Statism. Note what the quote says about these states being the primary actors in the global arena. States are seen as legitimate representatives of people in their national interests. In conditions of anarchy, where there is overarching order, sovereign states consider themselves to be the highest authority. Survival. Think about the point of self-preservation, because the international system is seen as an archaic states cannot guarantee their survival. Therefore, maintaining survival is the primary national interest of states, and such determines their actions. Self-help. The points about security and means of violence are here. In the absence of the world government, states are responsible for maintaining their own security and should not rely on other states or international organisations to do so for them. As a result, realism is viewed by some of inherently pessimistic, which its onus on competition or actual potential interstate conflict as overly state-centric, thus overlooking other variables in international behaviour. Military and strategic issues affecting the balance of power are given primacy and are seen as the main issues dominating the world politics. The basis motive driving states is survival or the maintenance of sovereignty. A realist interpretation of the US-China relations. Keeping the above information in mind, how you might interpret relations between the US and China through the prisms of realisms. You've seen that the realist approach emphasises anarchy and the balance of power. It also holds a state as its international interests as key, which translate into thinking about how states maintain their security. Therefore, a realist analyst of US-China relations might emphasise the competition between the two states in military and economic terms. We'll leave that there.